Welcome to Engage Arizona, Public Policy for Daily Life. On this episode, we will hear from Walt Heyer about the widespread misinformation about gender choice. He speaks to the dangers of embracing gender dysphoria and denying therapy for people struggling with their sexuality. Listen to his own experience of living as a woman for 8 years before finding the help he needed to be free.
All right, well, Walt Heyer, thank you very much for speaking with us. You have a very interesting story to tell. It is one for just a time as this. So briefly tell us what you went through, starting with when you were little.
Yeah, I started out at the age of 4 being cross-dressed by my grandma. And we go back to my age of 4, that was 1944. So there were no words like transgender. There were not words like gender dysphoria. There wasn't any of that stuff even spoken, so I had no idea, except my grandmother was affirming me. That word was certainly clear, as a young girl, saying how cute I looked and how wonderful I looked, and she just really fawned over me as a girl. And what I realize is that something immediately happens when someone like my grandmother put me in a dress. Is what they're speaking to you is that there's something wrong with you as a boy. In other words, she put me in a dress because I wasn't good as a boy, or I didn't look good, or there was just, you immediately understand there's something wrong with you, and you have some adult telling you that if you're going to be okay, you need to be in a dress if you're a boy, and that's the way you're going to be good. So it's, you got to remember a 4-year-old or so age, that's a blank canvas. They're coming out of the womb. They don't have much life experience. They're going to accept whatever an adult tells them. And if they're curious, like I was, because my grandmother was making dresses, I was curious about her making dresses. That was a curiosity. And Grandma took that as a desire. And while I didn't object, I loved her fawning over me. And so if she was going to fawn over me in a dress, I was going to enjoy it, because who doesn't like to be affirmed? I mean, I don't care who you are or what age you are. Being affirmed is pretty powerful in terms of a drug. It's a powerful thing that you seek out.
Especially as a child and from your grandmother.
Right.
Yes. So then take it from there as far as what the journey you went on.
Well, as soon as that happened, then I began to wonder. I remember going to bed late at night, and I'd lay there thinking about this and realizing that Grandma had told me that this was our little secret, that no one was supposed to know. So I had to hold on to this secret. I'm also too young to know that there's something wrong going on if you're holding a secret, because people aren't going to like what you're doing, but I learned that later, not at the time. I just laid there realizing there was something wrong with me. I ended up not going to sleep very quickly. My brother would fall asleep 2 seconds after his head hit the pillow. We were both in the same small bedroom, and I would lay there for hours thinking about what Grandma was doing and what that meant and why was she doing it. And yes, I was enjoying the affirmation, but what was this all about? Was there something really wrong with me? And so I began to feel different, and I held on to that, keeping in mind there's no therapist at that time, which I could have used. I could have used a good child psychologist to sit down with and explore this, and probably could have stopped this gender dysphoria from ever taking a deep root, and with her in her understanding of what she was doing by putting a boy in a dress. She didn't know the long-term consequences. And then the sexual abuse perpetrated by the uncle only added to that whole thing. Now, as time went on, I didn't even know the word transgender existed until 1952, when the headlines hit with Christine Jorgensen was reported the first transgender person. I think it was done in Sweden. And so in 1952, I thought, oh, that must be me. So I'd gone nearly 8 years without ever having a word or an understanding of what was going on. Now, a good therapist could have worked through that before this crazy transgender word was put in there, which is, incidentally, is a word invented by 3 pedophiles who coined the term. It was Harry Benjamin and John Money and some others who invented this word and began to attach it to people who take hormone therapy and have surgery. So I'm working with all these things and not really having any adequate place to deal with it until many years later, after I was married, had 2 children. I went to, quote, a gender therapist who himself was the author, the original author in 1979 of the Harry Benjamin International Standards of Care, which he wrote. He was the chairperson and wrote the Standards of Care in 1979. He was my therapist. He was my gender therapist. The number one guy in the world is the guy who addressed my issues with my grandmother, my father, and the sexual abuse. He said, well, you have, at that time it was called gender identity disorder, but he knew at that time that it was going to be changed to gender dysphoria. He told me during that conversation they're working on getting it changed to gender dysphoria. And the cure for your situation is hormone therapy and surgical transformation.
And how old were you at the time?
Would have been 39 or 40 at the time. I was a successful executive with American Honda Motor Company, had 2 children, had 3 cars, nice income, and I was one of the top executives for Honda at the time. I was the national port operations manager. But I'd been struggling with the purple dress, physical abuse, and sexual abuse since I was a youngster. And so when I finally encountered a quote, gender therapist, an expert in the field, he said, what you need is hormone therapy and surgery. And I had told him about my childhood, but in his view, that was irrelevant. And so I waited the 2 years, and that was 1981 when I encountered him and he diagnosed me. It was in 1983 of April when I underwent complete gender reassignment surgery, the whole thing in Trinidad, Colorado, under the knife of Dr. Biber. And he performed the surgery. I came out as Laura Jensen, female, in quotes, and had my birth record changed everything. I was terminated by Honda, which, by the way, I think was probably a good move. I did not think that it was appropriate. If they didn't want me there, I didn't feel the pressure for them to keep me there, although I would have liked to have kept the job. But people who suffer from these confusing gender identity issues are not healthy people. And I was one of them. There's something wrong with you when you cannot accept who you are and you're trying to mimic someone else. There's got to be something underlying that issue that requires good, deep psychotherapy.
Now, some people would argue that that is who they are and that they're just trying to become who they are. And they were, I'm sure you've heard it, right? A woman trapped in a man's body or whatever. What would you say to that?
Well, it's absolute nonsense. It's crazy making. And, this is, to me, is something like a child would say who's 5 years old and say, I want to be a fireman, or I want to be a doctor, or I want to be a policeman. And to codify that by giving people the idea that, yes, you are, and, just sort of affirm them in that, is where the illness becomes, because we're planting a delusional idea in their head. And I know people don't like that word, but it's the truth. When we lose touch with reality, and that's the whole transgender spectrum, is they've all lost touch with reality. They cannot become women, period. That's categorically impossible. And in fact, it should be absolutely an abhorrent idea to women that women are nothing more than a man with his genitalia removed and breast implants. I don't think that's what a woman is. I'm sorry. Women should be totally outraged by the idea that women are nothing more than a man with his genital rearranged, or a man saying, I'm a woman. I don't think you can just announce that you're a woman and be a woman. That's what I'm saying is insane, nonsense, and childlike behavior that requires a psychotherapist to sit down and say, why are you making such absurd announcements that you cannot prove?
Correct. And so going back to that point, and the fact that here in Arizona and in states throughout the country, they want to ban conversion therapy. They say that it is harmful, and a lot of times they're referring to practices that haven't been done in 75 years or more, the electroshock therapy and all of that, it really has been basic talk therapy for the past many, many years, just like you would get if you had depression or anxiety or something like that. And they want to get rid of it. They say that it is harming people because you can't be talked out of it.
Yeah, well, it's what it would do is actually harm the transgender movement, because if we realize that 70%, 60 to 70% of people who identify as a transgender person are suffering from psychological, either sexual, emotional, or psychological disorders. 30% of them are suffering from dissociative disorders. Many of them are suffering from bipolar disorder or body dysmorphia. Many of them are suffering from a sexual disorder called autogynephilia, which nobody ever talks about.
What is that?
Autogynephilia is where a guy dresses up in a dress and looks in the mirror and becomes sexually aroused by his own appearance as in the mirror that he sees, and that becomes his sexual partner. It's just the vision of himself in a mirror. It's a sexual fetish disorder.
Okay, something that
so nobody wants to talk about that. But the fact of the matter is, if people were allowed to have access, which they should have, free and fair access to therapy, what would really happen is it would destroy the whole transgender idea that people are something that they're not, because they would begin to uncover disorders like separation anxiety, autogynephilia, transvestic fetish disorder, dissociative disorders, even schizophrenia. Many of these individuals are suffering from what's called comorbidities, and the trans lobby does not want that on the front headline, that people are suffering from these things. People have speculated that even Jenner may be one of the people who has autogynephilia. That's been put out by people who are psychiatric doctors that follow this, not by me. And so I think it's important for us to understand that the vast majority of these individuals are suffering from psychological, emotional, and sexual disorders that have not been diagnosed and not been treated. And furthermore, if you prevent this, you're going to increase the number of people who are committing suicide. And by the way, more importantly, suicide.org, which is a completely non-specific, they're not on one side of this issue or the other. Suicide.org says, and I quote, 90% of all suicides are the result of untreated disorders. Untreated disorders. Now, is there any other community that has a higher degree of suicides than transgenders? No. And the reason that they have such high rates of suicide isn't society accepting them. It's the fact that they're living in a delusional world that they cannot accept, that doesn't fit with their own psychology. And when they're given hormones and surgery and they come out the other side like I did, I was suicidal because they lied to me. They said, this is the cure. Well, it's not. And what I find...
Were you suicidal before you had the surgery and then still after?
after only.
Wow.
And that's what's been reported by the UK Guardian, that actually suicides are not reduced by going through the hormones and surgery. Actually, the hormones and surgery are causing people to commit suicide because they feel like they hit the end of the road. They told me this would work, and it didn't work. So the only way out is to die, because when they tell you there's only one way to get this fixed, hormones and surgery, and it doesn't work, then what's the alternative? I may as well kill myself, and they do. So and that's why 40% of them attempt suicide.
Right. So tell me about what you went through after your surgery, what your thought process was, what you were feeling, and then what you did about it. And what.
Well, I was able, it took me a while, but I was able to finally get work for FDIC, the banking institution for the government. I worked at the post office. So I had good jobs. I lived in San Francisco at 17th and Judah. I had good income. I wasn't, scruffing off the streets or anything. But as I began to live out my life this way, I did start studying psychology at UC Santa Cruz because I'm a bright guy. I want to know what's going on with this. I'm now, in my later 40s, and began to study psychology and realized, and that's where I came across the first study about somebody having who became a transgender girl, female, because his mother died. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And what they said was, this is a case of separation anxiety. And what the person did was he assumed his mother's identity as a way to feel close to his mother, as if she hadn't died. He could assume her identity. That's a mental disorder. I'm sorry, hormones and surgery are not going to fix that disorder. They're not going to fix the other disorders that they have, such as bipolar, depression, and anxiety, and dissociative disorders either. So we've been, the nation has been sold a bill of goods because there's a lot of very powerful, very rich, wealthy people pushing the transgender agenda, when in fact it's totally bogus. And what's happening now is even Martina Navratilova has come out and said these are not women, and it's insane to call them women, and she's being slammed for it. I mean, they want to silence all of us. If I speak out like I am today, they say, well, he's a bigot, he's a Christian, he's a nut job. Isn't this interesting? They will say, well, he was never a transgender. So they can they can say that they are women, right? Try to get this. If you can get your head around this, this is magical. They can say they're women, at the same time say I was never a transgender? Really? Now you see how insane you have to be to have those two things going on in a parallel mind. That is mental disorder class A. And
so now you see, we read a lot of these stories where the acceptable thing to do when a little 5 or 7-year-old boy picks up a doll or puts on a dress, that immediately they say, oh, we need to start the hormone therapy, and then eventually it leads to surgery, and they say we need to embrace this and affirm them. When you watch that happening to little kids, what do you feel and what do you think?
Yeah, well, all kids are curious about gender, as they should be. I think that is perfectly natural. It's appropriate for them to have curiosity. I don't think there's anything wrong with a boy playing with a doll or a girl playing with a truck. What's wrong is saying they are gender dysphoric and that they're transgender kids and we need to change their clothes and give them a different name. That is where the adults are killing these kids. And I use that word absolutely, because these young people are committing suicide as a result of somebody telling them that they're transgender. They're not. In fact, what we know is from studies that if we leave them alone and let them explore without giving a boy a dress or without giving him another name and just let him work through this, we know that up to 92% of them will actually grow out of it. But here's the thing that's so abhorrent that we should all be very upset about. If we give them hormone blockers at 8 or 10 years old and lock them in, they are locked in. In other words, They will not grow out of it because we've locked them into it. So what's that tell us? Anybody with a bit of gray matter left in their brain will understand that we are manufacturing transgender kids by the use of hormone blockers and hormone therapies and cross-dressing them and giving them a female name. This is so out of touch with reality. It's insanity. And this is what's killing young people, ruining lives. It's tearing families apart. It's ripping people apart. I get the emails from them when they're 21 years old and they write me and say, Walt, I want to detransition. How can you help me? This is not a permanent solution. It's only a temporary reprieve from something that happened to them. And many of these people find out that while they were locked into this lifestyle, or guys were given orchiotomies, and then they're living out the female life, they know they can never have kids again, and they try to return to their boy identity, and it takes them sometimes years to work through that, but their facial appearance is different, and this is what's causing them to commit suicide. I'm sorry, but the trans lobby is responsible for their deaths, not society.
Mm-hmm. And so just briefly going back to the this bill that wants to ban this type of therapy, when you think about just talking through it, what was it for you? Tell me a little bit about your experience and why you think it is so important to get this therapy. Once you went and started talking about it, what was your experience like?
Well, my experience is the same as all the people that I work with. 100% of the people I work with all say the same thing that I'm about to tell you. Sitting down with a therapist and just talking through a childhood that was troubled by either a death or some kind of sexual abuse or emotional abuse is absolutely essential to a healthy psychological life. And emotionally, you need that someone you can trust to talk to, and therapists are good for that. And any kind of talk therapy is important. The therapy that I went through was just a guy, Sonny was his name. He was a great guy, and I would just sit and talk to him. And sometimes he would meet me at 10 o'clock at night. I would call him up and say, Sonny, I'm struggling. And he said, come to my office, let's talk. He gave me his home phone number so I could talk to him anytime I was under duress. And he said it was important for me to talk to you at the point that you are struggling so that I can work through what those issues are. And as a result of that, I'm able to speak to you today. And had I not had therapy, and I'm sure that the trans activists would really have preferred that I not have therapy. They would have preferred that I committed suicide or that I stayed transgender than me speaking out against this absolute abhorrent nonsense that men can become women, and that that hormones and surgeries treatment, when it's actually the worst thing you can do. I would say if you run into a gender therapist, run the other way and find somebody who is actually fit and sound and being able to provide good, effective psychotherapy for you, because a gender therapist is not going to do it.
Would you say the same thing about someone who has same-sex attraction, or is this strictly for gender dysphoria?
I was never homosexual. I don't understand same-sex attraction. I would say, I won't say all, 95% of the people I've worked with, which is in the hundreds of transgenders I've worked with, 95% of them were heterosexual men, not homosexual. And many of them were married and had kids. Many of them weren't, but I'd say it's probably a mix of both, but never engaged in homosexual activity, except when someone sexually abused them or emotionally abused them. It was almost always a man who themselves were mentally ill, who perpetrated an act upon them, a criminal act, by the way, because sexual abuse is a criminal act. And the people who do these acts should be prosecuted, locked up with the key thrown away.
So two more quick questions. So first, through this whole journey that you've had, what was the most difficult part of it? What was it that hurt you the most?
The thing that hurt the most was the Paul Walker, Dr. Paul Walker in San Francisco, the #1 gender therapist guy, telling me that hormones and surgery was the preferred treatment for me having had the early childhood experience of wearing a dress. That destroyed my life. I can tell you, it destroyed my income. I've been living with this horror now for 74 years. And that's why I'm so passionate at 78 years old, trying to convince people, stop these people from hurting young people. They're going to be speaking out 70 years from now, just like I am, if it still goes on. We need to stop this. It is absolutely abhorrent, and it is destroying lives. It is causing suicides. They are causing suicides. I'm sorry. The only way to prevent suicides is through suicide.org. What they said, they need to have their disorders diagnosed and effectively treated after they have had their disorders, regardless of what that disorder is. If it's childhood abuse, sexual abuse, if that's treated properly and effectively, at the end of that treatment, if they still are having gender dysphoria, that's a different thing. But I haven't found one person yet who hasn't had good, effective psychotherapy that ever wanted to be a transgender. They always say, I'm done with it. I don't want this. It was an escape. If people will just say, if that therapist would have told him, hey, Walt, look, I understand you were sexually abused, you were physically abused, your grandma wore a dress, you're not transgender, you don't have gender dysphoria, you were criminally abused, and you need to deal with that with a different therapist. And that gender therapist should have sent me to someone who has skill and is effective in treating people who have been criminally and sexually abused.
So last final words of encouragement for somebody who might be struggling.
Well, if you're struggling, get to a therapist who is not a rainbow cheering therapist, because the rainbow people will lead you right down the drain. They will ruin your life. Go to somebody who is an effective therapist who can look at what we call comorbid disorders. You can use the word comorbidities and go in there and say, I likely have some comorbid disorder that is causing me to want to change genders and not want to be who I am, because these people aren't becoming their real self. They're becoming their phony self. And if they want to be their real self, they won't go through hormones and surgery, because that's a masquerade. It is not the real self.
Thank you, Walt Heyer, for your time and for your willingness to share your story and expose this side of the issue that is not widely covered. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.